All right, well, hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Lester. Hello, welcome to the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. Thank you for joining us on our panel on the Wildland Urban Interface and Wildfires. My name is Lisa Lester. I'm a member of the PILC, but I'm also a 1L rep for the Black Law Students Association for the law school. I just have a few announcements and then we will get started with the panel. Just a tech warning, don't worry if you can't see yourself. This is a Zoom webinar, so all the attendees are automatically muted with videos off, so you will only be able to see the panelists. Throughout the panel, if you have a question, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. All of our panelists will be giving their presentations, and then there will be a 15-minute Q&A session at the end where the panelists will answer your questions. So please remember to be courteous of all viewpoints, and we'll move. Additionally, if there are any legal professionals in the audience wanting to earn CLE credit for the panel, here's the link to register and pay on job form. If you haven't registered, please do so. Also, our alumni board, Friends of Land, Air, Water, helps to provide stipends for students doing unpaid public interest environmental law internships. If you're interested in making a donation to help provide students with those stipends, information to do so will be on a Google document, which we'll drop the link to in the chat. If you'd like to make a donation to the Public Interest Environmental Law Summer Stipend Program, you may do so in two ways, either PayPal via payments@lawfriends.org or to Network for Good via this link, which I'll drop in the chat. Lastly, the University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the US government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions in their communities at UO and across the land we now refer to as Oregon. PILC would like to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya peoples in the Willamette Valley and express our respect for the tribal nations of Oregon. And we will now introduce our panelists. So first panelist, Sarah Adams-Schoen is a faculty member of the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Center. Her scholarship, applied research and service focus on climate change law and policy, state and local government law, and land use, focusing on climate resilience in the coastal and inland floodplains and wildland urban interface. She presents frequently on climate change and local law, including recently presenting as a featured speaker at the Columbia Journal of Environmental Law Climate Change Symposium, the keynote speaker at a New York Department of State and United States Geologic Survey Conference on water resource management, and a lecturer for the AALS Environmental Law section. She is admitted to the Oregon State Bar as a pro bono member and to the federal bar for the U.S. District Court for the District of Oregon. She serves on the editorial board of the Urban Lawyer and as the chair of the Land Use Committee of the ABA State and Local Government Law section, and as the section's liaison to the ABA's Commission on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. She's also the past chair of OGALA, the LGBT Bar Association of Oregon. Dr. Douglas Toomey is a professor of earth sciences at Oregon University. He is a project member of Alert Wildfire, a consortium of universities, including University of Nevada, Reno, University of California, San Diego, and the University of Oregon, integrating state-of-the-art pan tilt zoom fire cameras and associated tools to help firefighters and first responders. Alert Wildfire is currently partnered with numerous state and federal wildfire agencies, including the U.S. Forest Service and the Department of the Interior. And that's it for our introductions. So yeah. All right, Dr. Toomey, I know you said you had to go first because of time constraint, so I'll let you have the floor.
All right, thanks very much, Lisa. And I'm hoping that you can see my screen now. My name is Doug Toomey. I'm the director of the Oregon Hazards Lab at the University of Oregon, and thanks for this opportunity to talk to you about our research here. I'd like to point out that I'm trained as a seismologist, and in fact, a marine seismologist. And through my career, I've done experiments in many of the world's oceans, but over the past 5 or 6 years have turned the attention of our group to mitigating hazards in the Pacific Northwest. In 2018, we formed the Oregon Hazards Lab. Its mission statement is to use science, technology, and community engagement to understand, detect, and mitigate multi-hazards within the Pacific Northwest. During this presentation, I'd like to make 3 points. First of all, the urgency of societal needs is building infrastructure to support hazards detection and mitigation. The second is that infrastructure will support environmental education, research, and public service. And thirdly, and importantly, success requires direct engagement with policymakers, regional stakeholders, and the public. Throughout this presentation, I'll use 2 examples. First of all, the Shake Alert project, which is a West Coast-wide earthquake early warning project. And the second is Alert Wildfire, which is mountaintop pan-tilt zoom cameras for early fire detection and suppression. The urgency in the Pacific Northwest is significant. And what this figure shows is Oregon's public health hazard vulnerability. And on the y-axis to the vertical axis is the 5-year hazard probability. And you can see that at the topmost category is wildfire. It's our most frequent hazard in Oregon and throughout much of the West, as many people know right now. On the x-axis, or the horizontal axis, you can see the public health consequences from minimal effect to overwhelming the system. And on the far right of this is the Cascadia earthquake and tsunami. In the Pacific Northwest, we do have a very significant earthquake threat that occurs very infrequently, but when it does, can generate a magnitude 9+ earthquake and tsunami. And given that our infrastructure was built prior to knowledge of this potential catastrophe, much of our infrastructure is not ready to survive that. It's interesting to note that this graph was made in 2013. It's before the pandemic. It's also before wildfire really became much more frequent and much more challenging for us to address throughout the West. So the Oregon Hazards Lab is really focused initially on these 2 extrema. What can we do about the Cascadia earthquake and tsunami for providing public service? And what can we do for wildfire so that we can also provide public service and increase public safety? That infrastructure that we're building through the Shake Alert and Alert Wildfire projects will turn around and support environmental education, research, and public service. And I'm going to walk through this diagram and explain how we can do that. First of all, on the left-hand side, we're deploying sensor networks pretty much everywhere throughout the West Coast and the Pacific Northwest. As anybody who lives in Oregon knows, when you drive west to east over the Cascades, it's not too soon before you lose communication. You lose cell phone coverage, and that impacts not just you in trying to figure out where you're going to go, but it also impacts emergency responders in terms of how they can fight fires or other hazards. One of the things that seismologists are very good at is deploying sensors over the globe and bringing back data in real time, no matter whether or not you have cell phone coverage. So we're deploying sensor networks. Currently, we're focused on seismometers and cameras, but we're also funded for FEMA to plan an emergency alerting system for the McKenzie and Santiam corridors that were hit by the 2020 fires. And those alerting technologies or the sensors that we'll be deploying will be addressing not just wildfires and earthquakes, but also floods and landslides through those lifeline corridors. As you move from sensor networks into real-time technologies, this is a challenge, right? To be able to bring back real-time data throughout the landscape. It really is a computer sciences problem or an information technology problem where you need to build a robust and resilient network that can route around damage when it occurs. And so it's an opportunity for earth scientists to work with computer scientists and others in designing how these systems are both resilient, but also cyber secure. Eventually that data comes back to a cloud service somewhere. And this is where domain scientists can be involved. And domain scientists can be everybody from earth scientists to geographers, to meteorologists, to ecosystem scientists, to people studying the environment. And at that point, you have data scientists also working with computational scientists, trying to understand how to ingest that data, how to make actionable information from those data, but also conduct scientific research and education that is focused towards both discovery and public service. Lastly, on the right-hand side, we need to have actionable information. If you've been in the West in the past few years and you've seen how wildfires impacted communities, you know that many of those communities have not received timely alerts. The Shake Alert project is providing alerts to people's cell phones, and it's important to note that at that point it becomes a social science problem. How you provide actionable information to the public in a way that they can take action is not something that earth scientists or seismologists should be doing. It's something that we have to work with domain science or with social scientists to make sure that we're providing information in a way that it can be digested and acted upon quickly. So across this spectrum of activity, you have the natural sciences, the social sciences, data sciences. There's public policy as well. I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. Also, law and business are involved because you can imagine that there's a limited number of mountaintops throughout the West where we can have communication infrastructure, and that brings up interesting questions about access to those mountaintops in a fair and equitable way. Success requires direct engagement with policymakers and regional stakeholders, and this is part of our team here with Governor Kate Brown. In 2018, she published her policy agenda, Resiliency 2025, Improving Our Readiness for the Cascadia Earthquake and Tsunami. And fortunately, Governor Brown was looking beyond the Cascadia earthquake and tsunami. And if you look at Resiliency 2025, that agenda, it says the governor has directed the state resilience officer to implement a statewide emergency warning system by 2023 that ties multi-hazard events, earthquakes, wildland fires, landslides, and flooding events into one alerting and monitoring system. It's taken us many years to actually, both many years, but it seems also quite short when you look at it. This policy agenda was published in 2018. There was an opportunity to be funded in 2018 and 2019, and there was difficulty at the legislature in those years. There was a $12 million request in this policy agenda. In 2020, we received 7.5 million of that 12.5, and that was for the completion of the Shake Alert project, but also the communication backbone that supports the alerting. And just this week, in the short session at the Oregon legislature, they awarded the final $4.5 million for Alert Wildfire and building out wildfire camera systems. This has been both a short time, but also quite a bumpy road to get to that success. And I will say it's been quite fascinating and interesting to work with the governor's office, to work with our legislative champions. Much to my pleasant surprise, I found out, whether it's in Salem or in testifying in DC, that policymakers are really eager to interact with scientists and others to improve resiliency. And so I think the success in these areas requires that scientists engage directly with policymakers and our regional stakeholders in the public. So I'll finish up and say, where we started, OHAS uses science, technology, and community engagement to understand, detect, and mitigate multi-hazards within the Pacific Northwest. Two of our three pillars, I think, are now firmly in place. The Shake Alert program is doing very well. We'll complete the build out of the sensor system by 2023. With this week's action by the Oregon legislature, we're now working cooperatively with all the principal groups responsible for wildfire mitigation in Oregon, and that includes the Oregon Department of Forestry, BLM, National Forest Service, the Wildland, the Western Fire Chiefs, and structural firefighters. And so it's really exciting to see that really strong and diverse team come together and be moving in one direction. And the last thing is, the third pillar is, I think, what we're working on now is how we can improve stewardship of place in a changing climate. And we like to refer to that as the Internet of Wild Things. How can we deploy many low-cost, low-power sensors throughout the region so that we can monitor air quality, water quality, forest health, etc. So I'll stop there and say thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to be here. Claire, if you want to go, please do.
Well, I was thinking, would you like to take questions now before I talk?
If it's possible to do that, I do apologize. With the legislative action this week, it has generated a lot of activity for our group. And we have a leadership group meeting that conflicts with this conference. So if anybody does have questions right now, please ask them. Alternatively, if you want to email me and contact me, please do so. Just look up Doug Toomey at the University of Oregon.
Yeah, I would encourage anyone in the audience who has a specific question for Doug Toomey, if you're prepared to do it, you could ask now, just because our expertise are really very different. I won't be able to take his questions. So I'll just I don't see questions yet in the Q&A, but maybe let's just pause for a moment to allow for those. And while we wait, I have a question for you, Doug. So, with this influx of funding, I think I'm curious what you think is maybe kind of the most powerful, use of these monies to help move Oregon forward with respect to wildfire resilience.
That's an excellent question. I read a book a few years ago by Shone called The War on Science, and I highly recommend it. And one of the things I took away from it was the need for the academic community to engage with all policymakers and regional stakeholders. One of the beneficial things about receiving the funding is that now we can go to the private sector, for example. As we know in the West, utilities don't start the largest number of fires, but they sometimes do have starts on the worst possible day because of high wind conditions that cause failure in power lines. So one of the things that I think we can do is reach out to the various private sector stakeholders in the region, not just the Department of Forestry and BLM and Forest Service and state and federal agencies, but also form a partnership that goes across all stakeholders. And this is not a hard lift. I mean, I've already, for example, the Eugene Water and Electric Board is investing in wildfire cameras. Central Lincoln PUD, as Portland General Electric has. You go to California, there's over 1,000 cameras supported by the independently owned utilities. So I think when it comes to climate change and the hazards that face us, getting out of our lane a little bit, getting out of our academic lane and leveraging opportunities to work with others is the best way to use that money. I see two questions. Can you comment on risk from Cascadia to natural gas pipelines? Should I type an answer to that or can I answer it verbally? Lisa, does it matter?
Sorry about that. You can answer verbally, you can type it, it's up to you.
Yeah, I would say that there's a significant risk in Oregon in particular because most of our liquid fuel goes through the critical energy infrastructure hub in Portland. The CEI hub is built on quote unquote reclaimed lands, meaning they dredged up soft sediments from the bottom of the Willamette River and made a platform to build storage tanks on. Soft sediment liquefies during large earthquakes. And so one of my primary concerns after having traveled across the state and talking to many different stakeholders is that after a large earthquake, that our fuel supply would be greatly limited. And that means that bulldozers, ambulances, cars, all the things we need to help recover will not have fuel to make them move. So that is a significant problem. I don't know enough to say about individual natural gas pipelines, but I would say liquid fuel is a significant concern for the state. And I believe the Oregon legislature also acted on that in the recent short session to take a look at the CEI hub and start building up fuel stores elsewhere. The second question is, how do you see these modern remote sensors interacting with more traditional fire detection methods like staffed lookouts and recon flights? Do you see these cameras as a viable replacement? Yes, they already have been a viable replacement. My father was a lookout, a fire lookout on Odell Butte when he was in high school in Oregon. That's one of the few manned lookouts that is still in the state of Oregon. It's actually cheaper to have cameras out there. The towers get condemned. I've seen some of those myself. And then when you have the camera sensors, they can be accessible from anywhere, from your phone, your iPad. So if you want to, go to alertwildfire.org. And a big aspect of our camera system is it is accessible in two ways. First of all, the public gets to see what's on the cameras, and they can see time lapse from 15 minutes to 12 hours. We know that that allows people to take protective action before they're given the go signal from emergency managers. And that's useful because, some people will be cautious and get themselves out of harm's way earlier, and that prevents fewer people clogging roads when it becomes a real issue. The second way the cameras are accessible is through a proxy login. The public cannot control the cameras, they can view them. But if you're a firefighter, if you're at NIFC, if you're at an incident command center, you can log on to the cameras, use the PTZ feature. They're near infrared at night. It's easier to spot fires at night than it is during the day because they're near infrared. And we're also putting up FLIR cameras that are true infrared when a significant fire occurs. So I would say that bang for the buck, cameras are going to beat maintaining lookout towers and having those be manned by people. In terms of recon flights, they're essential. That's not going to replace that. There's things you can do with both autonomous vehicles and flights themselves. So it's a very complementary part of the tool set. Thanks, Dan.
All righty, well, we can continue to wait for some questions to come in, but thank you, Dr. Toomey. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
So let me jump in now. Getting ready to share my screen. Okay, well, thank you so much for having me to the, asking me to join this presentation. And so one of the things I really want to focus on for the presentation is the essential role of land use law in, mitigating the effect of, mitigating the risk, I should say, of wildfire. And I'm going to focus on the Mountain West in Oregon. So before I do that, I wanted also to point out that what I'm talking about is the management of land. And I want to just take a moment to, in addition to acknowledging the land that we're on and the historic caretakers of that land and residents of that land, I want to also acknowledge that when we're managing the land, right, as this quote, which I'll pause in a moment to read, as this quote makes this point, that we're managing the identity and culture people who are intimately connected to that land. And so I'll just read this. Our lifeways are tied to animals, landscape features, cultural sites, important animals such as seabeds, seals, whales, first foods such as fish, clams, crabs, seaweed, and kelp, as well as things just like shells that we use in regalia. And when the state manages those natural resources, they also manage our identity and culture, right? So, and this is a quote from Margaret Corby in the sources at the bottom of the slide. So I want to acknowledge that. So not just where we're sitting in this moment, but our whole task, our whole approach to the management of resources and land, you know, also is a colonizer, settler approach, and really could be, you know, so much more powerful if we integrate it with the historic caretakers of the land. So we're talking today about, or I'm talking today about land management. And so I'm going to just start with the term WUI, right? Wildland urban interface. And the reason that I like to use this WUI slide is because I really like to highlight what's going on here. And what's going on here is this development, right, of human settlement, right? In this case, a residential subdivision. And over here also a residential subdivision into the wildland, right? And that interface, right, is growing. That interface between human settlement and wildland, or, you know, as some call it, wildland fuel, right? Because fire. So let's see. That's it. I was just looking at a Q&A point that says, in addition to human development increasing into the WUI, here where I live in Eastern Oregon, the WUIs have been expanded dramatically for political reasons and due to pressure from the timber industry, saying it's easier to log in the WUI. And can you help us distinguish between politically drawn WUI boundaries and the functional definition? How can we ensure we don't get bad outcomes due to absurd boundaries that counties and other entities have created? It's a really interesting question. I'm going to come back to it later, but for my purposes, what I'm talking about, the WUI, is what I'm really talking about is any pattern of development when I talk about it. What I'm focusing on is the concerns that are raised by developing into forest lands. So I'll just keep going. And, you know, this is something that's just rapid, right? That's rapid and increasing. And, you know, the West Coast and Mountain WUI is one of the fastest growing zones of residential land development. And, you know, I also do a lot of coastal work, and that's our other fastest zone, right? You know, the coastal floodplains. So we love to develop into hazards, you know, it turns out. And for reasons that I'll get to in my presentation, we're loath to limit that development. You know, so, okay, right? And this is old, but it's still true. I mean, the data is not precise anymore because of the age, but the point being made here, if the relationship between new housing unit construction and additional housing units in the WUI remains unchanged, between 2000 and 2030, there will be an additional 12.3 million WUI units in the West, etc. The point being that we are just continuing to rapidly develop into this, you know, this wildland, and to what effect? Right. And Phoenix, this slide is not actually a good example because this is not a slide that's showing the effect of rapid development into the WUI. This community has been, you know, this is a rural Oregon community that had been in place for some time and was not rapidly developing. The reason I put this slide here is because before I progress any further, I just want to acknowledge that wildfire risk isn't just threatening new development into the WUI, right? As we know, wildfire risk is, you know, threatening and destroying communities throughout Oregon, including established communities. So I really put this here to honor, the many people who have lost, loved ones and their homes and their communities. And this one, clickbait as it is, right, with the hell on earth, but that's really been the experience for so many, and not just from fire, but also from smoke. As we, in the Northwest and in, in Oregon and in California, so many places, Colorado, and so much of the Mountain West have experienced. And, this wildfire smoke, right, is incredibly harmful, right, in terms of, public health. And this is after the 2020 wildfire season, showing the estimated elderly excess deaths per million people, right? So this is excess deaths because, this is one way of estimating the harm, right? And so I'm just showing Portland, and Portland didn't even have like the worst smoke of all of Oregon. But I mean, just look at this massive spike in excess deaths, so smoke is just, a major threat. And, these things aren't going away, as I think everybody who's probably present here today knows. I mean, things are getting worse, not better. So this idea, I think sometimes when I'm talking to my layperson friends who are pretty, they probably have to go and meditate or go for a run after talking to me about risk. But I think, we really need to combat the impression that these terrible wildfire seasons are anomalous and not likely to recur. So what am I saying? Maybe we should just all throw up our hands. We're screwed. Well, certainly we've got a lot of risk to contend with, but that isn't really my point. My point is we need a paradigm shift. And, I do a lot of talks. In fact, I did one yesterday on coastal, and floodplain issues. And I make the same point there, right? We need a paradigm shift from engineering, right, to make hazard areas safer, to land use management that guides development away from hazard areas, right? So instead of how do we build, where do we build? We need to be, focusing on where do we build. And unfortunately, when we talk about the where do we build issue, a word that's often used, in the scholarly literature, but also just, amongst policymakers, and, it's made its way into the public, is retreat, right? There's been, for a long time now, discussions about approaches to climate and natural hazard risk that talk about accommodation and retreat, right? And, accommodation are, examples of that, or how do we accommodate development in hazard areas? How do we make that development more resilient so that it can occur in those areas? And retreat is how do we not develop there at all? Or even how do we move what's there, move the development out and retreat from the area. But the problem with retreat is retreat doesn't sound like something that, as a political issue we can all get behind. This is Fort Sumter, by the way. So, okay, well, I want to dig into why and also do some, get into some of the details about retreat, because I think this concept of retreat sounds like the government's going to come in and make you move off your land. And it sounds like, of course, also the giving up, right? But retreat, retreat needs to be reframed, and I'm going to get to that. Okay, so I also want to point out, so here we have Oregon Statewide Planning Goal number 7, areas subject to natural hazards. So to protect people and property from natural hazards, right? We have this goal: local governments shall adopt comprehensive plans to reduce risk to people and property from natural hazards, which include wildfire. And over here, adopt or amend as necessary based on evaluation of risk, plan policies and implementing measures consistent with the following principle: avoiding development in hazard areas where the risk to people and property cannot be mitigated. So right here in this, in the goal, at least with respect to Oregon, and these are called goals in Oregon, but they're actually legally enforceable and codified in law, right? So right here we have, science-based, that we should have science-based decisions regarding our land use management policies and regulations that lead to the avoiding of development in hazard areas. And I know you're not going to look at, I don't expect anyone to kind of read all these, but these slides will be available later. Goal 7 really has not been, it has not been implemented in as robust a way as many of the other Oregon planning goals. And especially with respect to that particular, right, this one right here, avoiding development in hazard areas. There really has not been a requirement that happen. And so I'm going to talk about why and how land use law can help with this, and land use law expertise, right? So why do local governments continue to allow development in the WUI? And, we could also ask, why do state courts continue, at least in Oregon, where these goals are legally enforceable, why do state courts, continue to allow local governments not to do that? And I do want to say, I'm generalizing here. There are local governments that are doing amazing work, and the state is doing some amazing work. But what I'm talking about, right, what I observe when I inventory local government laws in this area is that right now, local governments that are really restricting development into the WUI are the outliers. And of course, Oregon has another way of restricting development into the WUI, which it is much more assertive in terms of its enforcement, and that is through the urban growth boundary. But I'm not going to focus on that right now. But generally speaking, why do local governments continue to allow development in the WUI? And now I'm just generally speaking, not just Oregon, right? Well, money, right? Development, right? Development into undeveloped areas often includes annexation of land into the local government, boundary, which expands the land that is subject to local property tax, right? And increases that local tax base. Also, new development brings with it this opportunity for local governments to place conditions on the approval of a final subdivision plat, meaning, right, that the developer has this proposed development, and the local government, as part of the land use law process, can condition approval of that development on things like the developer, creating or maintaining or transferring title to the local government for streets, parks, schools, all sorts of things which fiscally constrained local governments can't, are needing. And so there's this incentive, right? Not just to develop, but even to develop undeveloped land. There's also the problem of the chilling effect of regulatory takings litigation, right? So, why do local governments hesitate to limit development? They're afraid they're going to be sued. And then there's also, the life cycle of government and politics, and there's more reasons, of course. But politics, right? Like, it's not a popular decision to not have enough money. It's not a popular decision to limit development, and this isn't always the case, but it's often the case. And what I've experienced when I'm consulting with local governments on hazard mitigation and bringing up the question of, restricting development, what I've discovered is that most local governments, that's a no-go, right? Restricting development, and certainly, of course, the question of, like actually, retreat in the sense of having people move from already developed areas is certainly also a no-go. For one, you're going to have to pay them. So, all right. So let me get more into this essential role of land use law scholars and attorneys in interdisciplinary wildfire adaptation research and policymaking. So this is just Oxford University, by the way, because I was thinking about scholars when I created the slide, and that's why I used this very elitist background here. Okay. So, right, well, one is that I just raised that specter of the Fifth Amendment and regulatory takings, right? No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That's the substantive due process clause, but nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation, right? And so that's the part I'm going to focus on, right? Private property be taken for public use without just compensation. I'm not going to spend more than a few minutes on this, but, so one thing is that can be a real lack of understanding regarding the ability of local governments to constrain development, right? So, just kind of the key cases here. So this Lucas case, which was a coastal case, right? There, if the local government or the state government, totally deprives the landowner of economic use of their land, then you're going to have what's called a per se taking, unless a background principle of state law, unless basically the person wasn't allowed to use the land anyway, based on something like a nuisance law or the public trust. So and then we have, if the local government is actually requiring the landowner to allow the government or third party to invade their land, then we have another per se type taking under Lingle. But what's most likely to actually apply when we're talking about development restriction really should be Penn Central, which is a balancing test and doesn't it's not a per se test, and it's a balancing of factors. And typically, it really does allow for local government or state government regulation. It's challenging for the landowner to win under Penn Central, right? Because then the court looks at the economic impact on the property, which could be pretty great, but it also looks at interference with investment-backed expectation of the owner. And if you own property in the Mountain West that's on the right there on the edge with that wildland, do you really have an expectation? And I've left out an important word here, reasonable, right? With reasonable investment-backed expectation. At this point in time, given, what the kind of the slides and the things that I showed earlier, I think more and more landowners really don't have a reasonable expectation of intensively developing that land. And then this other factor, character of the government action. If the government action is to, prevent, public health, major public health problems and mortality, and if it's a safety measure, then this third factor is going to weigh heavily in favor of not finding a taking. So as long as the local or state action doesn't completely wipe out the value of the property, the regulatory takings question favors government intervention, right? And that's because we know this risk is great and it's a safety measure. This is just also, this is regarding coastal property, but we could say the same thing now about the Mountain West and the WUI, right? So this is from the Lucas opinion. Coastal property may present such unique concerns for a fragile land system that the state can go further in regulating its development and use than the common law of nuisance might otherwise permit. without kind of parsing this apart into all of its detail, the same point can certainly be made now with respect to, well, the fragile ecosystem of the forest, but also the vast and great and known harm of continuing to develop, where we know we're going to have wildfire, an increasingly lengthy and impactful wildfire seasons. But it isn't just with respect to lawyers' roles and legal scholars' roles with respect to analyzing things like the regulatory takings question. There's so much more that legal scholars and attorneys with expertise in land use law can do to to help create safer development patterns and help create safer human settlements, communities, right? And so right now I'm highlighting this slide, which is about, really I want to just bring some attention to our Environmental and Natural Resources Law Center at University of Oregon. One of the projects we have at the Law Center is the Sustainable Land Use Project, where we have student fellows and attorney, research associates, and we're doing really fantastic work on climate mitigation and adaptation, and interdisciplinary work, funded work, and so what is this work doing? It's in addition to looking at legal doctrine like regulatory takings or public trust, right? Well, one thing it's doing is really digging deep into strategies and that can be used, and land use law strategies that can be used, as well as obstacles and considering where is land use not an effective strategy, right? But so I just listed some of them here, right? The use of and the consideration of setbacks, transfer of development rights. So transfer of development rights would say, you landowner who have this land here, which is in the hazard area, you can transfer your development right over here. Well, maybe you don't own over here. Well, that's fine. You could sell that transferable development right. So you then have some economic use still of your land. So, hey, we're under Penn Central and not Lucas, right? But also, depending on the value of that transfer, perhaps, especially in light of what we now know about risk, you can maybe even get really community and even landowner support around that. Of course, part of that is you need comprehensive planning and really robust, diverse public participation. And we have local governments in Oregon who've done this around wildfire. I could just highlight Ashland as an example, really incredible wildfire planning, including a public participation process that reached agreement around development restriction. But I also want to say robust has to include robust and diverse. Land use has traditionally been, very much a white male-dominated field, land use law and planning, and kind of reaching back to my first slide regarding land management, leaving out the diverse perspectives makes the outcome, less robust and less equitable. And so, land use law has also traditionally and still to this day shifted a lot of the burden of land management onto communities of color, while hoarding benefits of land management to usually white or usually predominantly white and predominantly middle and upper class neighborhoods and people. So, the need here, to get to these, to create this comprehensive plan, we really have to kind of rethink what public participation looks like. And, some local governments in Oregon and throughout Oregon, and Oregon state laws supporting this as well, are already doing this. Eugene has been going through Eugene and other cities throughout Oregon that are right now implementing House Bill 2001 with respect to middle housing, have been using some pretty great and kind of unprecedented public participation tools. And I've been involved in Eugene's work there, and have really, as a scholar with a lot of experience in this area, can say that I'm seeing some real improvement in the robustness and the diversity of public participation. Updating land use plans to avoid building or rebuilding in hazardous areas, basing hazard determinations on reasonably foreseeable hazards within the lifespan of development, right? Not within just the next 10 years, but what is the lifespan of that development? So if we think about a building or a subdivision as having, at least an 80-year lifespan, is it going to be resilient for 80 years? Is it going to be resilient for 5 years, right? Amending state and local law to facilitate retreat of structures from hazardous, from the most hazardous areas. And then, but also reframing what retreat is, right? Retreat does not have to be no development at all. And it also does not have to be the removal, right, of structures. Retreat can be a de-intensification of land uses. So perhaps it isn't, a commercial area or a dense residential area or a residential area at all. And also to just remember that, we can start with the low-hanging fruit. There's really very little development restriction going on at all. So instead of thinking about, removing structures, and forcing or even allowing for voluntary agreement to move from habited, structures that are already inhabited, just stopping or even limiting that growth into undeveloped land, and enforcing and expanding of land protections. So Lisa, what's the time frame of this panel? Can you remind me? I know I've been told, but
Yeah, we're going until 11 a.m. actually, so.
only
right on
until
time.
I'm sorry about that. Well, let me stop and take questions, because this isn't a bad time to do that then.
I actually had a question for you specifically about retreat, just because I grew up in a wildland urban interface neighborhood in Southern California in the foothills. And I was wondering, with the question of as you said, things will continue to evolve, which I completely agree. But the insurance situation, do you think that might expedite the retreat process as the insurance situation changes for people who are residents in WUI areas?
Yeah. Yes, I think that and I'm not an expert on insurance or insurance law, but, as, insurance companies deem the risk to be too great, right? So that rates go up to the point where they're unaffordable, or insurance companies won't private insurance won't be available at all, which is, what the nation saw, leading up to the National Flood Insurance Act in 1968, I believe, right? So, where flood risk in hurricane zones, and places was so great that private insurance was basically not available. I think, we're definitely seeing that. And I think we're going to see more of that with respect to WUI. So, that's going to factor in. But then what happens when there's no private insurance? Disaster funding payouts, right? So there's a huge increase in that. And then also, just incredible hardship for the people. Even when there is insurance, even when there is disaster money, there's incredible hardship. So as there's less and less of that, the hardship is just going to be even more. And, and also to acknowledge that even when there's insurance and disaster payouts, portions of the kind of displaced and traumatized population don't even get to access that. Renters, don't always, get the benefit, especially, on, renters in, structures where the rental wasn't authorized, right? So illegal renters, the renter themselves. I don't like that terminology, but yeah. So we can see some, I think, that's kind of like a market effect, right? That will drive some retreat from the WUI. The problem is, and I've seen this in the flood areas too, is it takes a massive scale of disaster for the market to respond, for the housing market to respond. And, part of that is a growth mentality, but part of that also is, a housing crisis.
Sir Adams-Schoen, we actually have to end this webinar to be able to set up for the next one. Really appreciate your time, and we hope to see our audience in our next panel, which deals with fur farming and its impact on our health and welfare. Thank you all for attending, and we'll see you soon.
I'm sorry, can I say one thing? I know
Absolutely.
you need to set up, but I just want to show one thing before people go. Hopefully, I can't tell who's even on this, but I wanted to share that next Friday, March 11th, we're having another event. It's from 8:30 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. Pacific. It's climate resilience or housing justice and other false choices. So we'll be talking about the question of housing justice in the context of creating climate resilient urban communities. And one of the panels will be discussing strategies and barriers to providing housing security and affordability during wildfire recovery. I just wanted to highlight that event. If you want more information about that event, it's on, you can find it on, I'll just tell you, it's law.uoregon.edu. Well, actually, if you just search for Housing Land Advocates Conference or Climate Resilience or Housing Justice and Other False Choices, you'll find it. It's on our ENR's website under events. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Thanks, everyone.